Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our 2-minute warning feature interview, where every week we take a deep dive into the energy transition and take a look at the challenges that it's presenting governments and companies and some of the solutions that are being put forward. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Mr. Sean Kidney, co-founder and CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative, which is an international NGO based in London, aiming to mobilize global capital to be put towards climate change projects. So thank you very much, Sean, for joining us today. And I'd like to start by asking you what state we're in at the moment in terms of climate finance globally. Where are we at?
Well, there's two ways of answering that question. First, in terms of the development of climate finance, we're at the very early stages. This is a market that needs to be seeing 5 to 7 trillion US a year allocated towards climate finance to achieve our Paris Agreement goals. We're probably no more than about $1 trillion so far. So a long way to go.
A long way to go. And it's a new market and it's a new area of investment. That would be the obvious answer as to why we're still sort of behind, if you like. But what would you identify perhaps as the top 3 sort of barriers to why we haven't seen more money put towards these solutions so far?
Look, it's very straightforward. We have not, as societies, engaged with the climate challenge. We've talked about it for 30 years. We've said to the scientists, look, that's really great, but look, it's just very hard to do that. Can we do this instead? And that has led us down to climate change action plans at a member states that are not adequate to the challenge, which is why if you look at the NDCs, the climate change action plans that are that populate the UN process, they would add up to about 4 degrees warming if we implemented them all, and it's unlikely we will. So we've got to break this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said very clearly, to be able to have even a reasonable chance of a future for your kids and my kids and all our kids, we've got to cut emissions by 55% by 2030. Now, that is actually a lot. That means dramatically changing the foundations of our whole Western economy, which has been so successfully built on fossil fuels for the last 150 years. That's the core part. And a whole lot of other changes like land use changes and so on that are required too. And of course, net zero carbon by 2050 has got to now be the global objective. But it's very important to bear that in mind, is that it's not a linear projection. It's a J-curve projection we've got to get. In other words, the biggest changes are the next 10 years. If we don't make this, we don't have much of a future. And the challenge is our governments, our policy makers, our decision makers, us, have not been adequately realizing or accepting what we've got to do. And we've been going slow on everything, including our own air travel habits.
Including our own personal efforts. I mean, I mean, obviously, you know, when it comes to putting money into anything, you know, investors look for returns, right? I mean, that is ultimately what they seek, if short term or long term. Is there enough data out there, do you think, to attract those investors as to the benefit, not just the climate benefits, obviously, of investing in these projects, which hopefully most informed people will be briefed on, but as to the actual, you know, financial incentives to actually invest in these? I mean, ESG funds have taken off. They're certainly attracting a lot more money every year from big investors. You know, is the access to the financial, I suppose, reward being made clear enough as well?
So now we get to the good news. We're way behind. We haven't done enough asset creation, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, we know what the solutions are. It's pretty straightforward. And we have the capital. We have a world swimming in capital.
We've seen that this year. We've seen a lot of money being made available when there's a reason to make it available by governments. So why can't they show the same commitment?
It's amazing how much. And what's particularly striking is we've got to the end of the year and interest rates are still extraordinarily low in the key capital pools of the world, as in Europe, Japan, and the US. And they're not going to be able to get a return in those markets because those markets are not going to grow. So if you like, you've got something really exciting here. A big chunk of money over here looking for returns, and over here, a big pipeline of things we have to create. And you know what? When we make that pipeline green, the money rushes to it at double or triple the normal speed. And the evidence is here is the green bonds and the green sukuk market, where we're currently at about $1 trillion outstanding, which is not too bad for a beginner market. We're no longer a minnow, and it's growing like a bullet. And the daughters of the green bonds market, the sustainable bonds, the social bonds, etc., are also growing very, very fast. A few weeks ago, the European Commission did the second placement of social bonds. They've now placed in the last 2 months 28 billion euros of social bonds for 300 billion euros of demand. Right. Now, all of these thematic bonds or thematic sukuk get this amazing investor interest in them. So we've kind of got the investors who need places to go to, especially keen on this particular format. They like the reporting, they like the transparency, they like the contribution to social good that they can report back to their stakeholders, and it just goes. So that's the good news.
What percentage of the global bond issuance market currently is being taken up by the green bonds? I mean, where are we at there? Obviously it's nascent, but well, what's approximately?
Global thematic bond issuance this year will be about 300 billion, whereas global bond issuance, if I remember quickly this year, because of the huge pile of sovereign issuance, is going to be something like 15 to 20 trillion. So we've got a way to go.
Yeah,
you would say we've got a way to go. But at the same time, this is the fastest growing asset class on the planet.
Yeah, and where would you say it is fast? And I mean, you know, I've got a few savings in the bank and I'm not earning any interest. So like, I'd like to know what I can invest in, which will give me a return these days. But let me ask you then, just from a sort of regional comparative point of view, I mean, you're obviously very versed on this market, and you know, we all read about green bonds and climate bonds, but zeroing in a bit on the Middle East here, what level of understanding do you think there is here? I mean, it's a unique type of economy in the Gulf as well, but perhaps less of a need to raise finance for certain initiatives. But where are we at with the level of understanding in the Middle East in relation to these types of financial tools?
Well, let me first pick up a point earlier, because you talked about returns. And it's important to note that in the established green finance market, we are talking about equivalent or better returns. In the bond area, where I work, the fixed income area, largely, it's a defensive market. People are investing first to ensure they don't lose money because they've got liabilities to meet in 5, 10 or 15 years' time. And yield is useful, but a secondary aspect. Now, what we see happening in secondary markets now is that green bonds outperform their peers, and in downturns, they hold their value, unlike ordinary bonds.
And why is that? Why is that?
Variety of reasons. The extra appetite for green bonds is part of the story, because as I mentioned earlier, everyone would like to get one on balance, and there's a little bit of price give within that. There's a lot of buy and hold investors, so it reduces availability. Interesting enough, you still get liquidity. In March, I had one big investor report to me that liquidity had totally disappeared for vanilla bonds, but for green bonds, they could still buy them or sell them. So some very interesting characteristics in this particular market. Whatever, it's a premium market on the secondary market. And as a result, these are worth a little bit more. They're a defensive strategy. So you've now got price benefit. You've got a lot of people participating in this market who do not care about the green aspect. All they care about is that these have got better returns or better defensive characteristics. So when you say the benefits, for those people that are concerned about institutional placement, green bonds are performing absolutely fantastically. They're better, if you like. And that's the interesting part of how this is going forward. This is not a reduced return story. This is an improved return story.
Yeah.
But for you as a single investor, you don't have a lot of options because there's not a lot of retail issuance around. It's a little bit in some markets.
Yeah, as a retailer,
Australia and India.
Very new. And there is the fear factor of the unknown. It's a new market that doesn't have a track record, if you like. And how important is that, whether it's to retail or institutional investors? Obviously, it's a new market. The returns are being proven, you know, as we speak. Your organization does get involved in certain certifications and definitions, and sort of obviously trying to reinforce and perhaps reassure those investors of the parameters around which how these bonds are issued. How important do you think that is in terms of attracting investors? You know, it's the fear of the unknown. So how can we reassure and entice people more beyond the financial return?
Well, I think it was the Financial Times that said markets, the value of markets is increased when there are boundaries. And ensuring that there is a proper boundary in this market is part of our job. And frankly, that's working so far. We have a market that is very focused on climate change and is becoming more focused on quality climate change. In the European Union, the European taxonomy, which is a regulation about ensuring that green bonds and other disclosures are consistent with the Paris Agreement, is coming into force. This backs up the story and so on, and affects one of the largest capital pools on the planet. So we're involved both as an independent standards organization and advising governments in ASEAN, in Latin America, and in China about this.
I mean, Europe seems to be ahead on the sort of stimulus front. Was it, you know, had it announced its sort of Green Deal this summer, and even its general economic stimulus that it's been doing in the last year because of COVID, it had dedicated, you know, 50% of that towards sort of green finance, if you like. So Europe seems to be, as it has been in terms of clean energy, ahead of the game, really. Let's take a look at the Middle East and Asia. I'd like to talk about China, obviously being the largest consumer in the world and a big polluter thus far, but now beginning to take some steps, you know, in terms of its pledge to be net zero by 2060. And
but more than that, in the context of green bonds, based on the Chinese domestic definitions of green, it's the world's largest green bond market already in the space of 5 years. The central authorities are really pushing hard on how to shift that economy. And that has a flow-on effect to the rest of the world, of course.
And has that had a big uptake and interest?
Absolutely, absolutely. We have extraordinary level of interest in China around green instruments. There are something like 10 times as many green loans as green bonds. We generally try and focus on tracking the green bonds, but the green loans is becoming more important. And now there are other kinds of thematic issuance. There are incentives. You know, if you're a bank and you hold green bonds on your balance sheet, and you go to the central bank for some liquidity, the liquidity lending window will give you, if you post green bonds as collateral, a 1% discount on wholesale funds. Whoa, that is a pretty cool incentive. I wish I had that. And
banks, I mean, again, and correct me if I'm wrong, banks have been generally, I mean, commercial banks who offer loans to businesses, whether it's SMEs or large, they've tended to be, at least in this part of the world, in the Middle East, a bit risk averse when it comes to green finance. You know, they've left it to the other, I suppose, instruments in the market to do that. They seem to follow on once, you know, others have taken a step, when they have the umbrella of protection from sort of the larger financiers. Is that true to say?
Look, I think you were right earlier when you were saying the need to raise capital hasn't been as great in the Gulf, and the past source of capital, government capital, have dominated what's happening. It's beginning to change. I mean, clearly amongst some governments, particularly the UAE government, we now see a significant shift towards trying to green their economies and look to a different footing going forward. The Saudi government has made it very clear that by 2050, they expect Saudi to be a solar energy exporter way before it's a petrol energy exporter. So there's an economic shift happening in Saudi at the moment. You know, NEOM that's been built on the on the Red Sea is going to be fueled entirely by renewable energy, which is a whole city, including industrial complexes of this. This is part of Saudi's attempt to shift their economy. So this is happening, right? The thinking. Now, of course, in terms of the instruments, it will follow, but we're beginning to see it now. We've seen a series of green sukuk and a couple of green bonds out of the area.
𝖬𝖷 has launched one, didn't they?
𝖬𝖷's done a transition bond.
That's right. Yeah.
I'm actually a little bit critical of that particular bond. I mean, they did the right thing, transparency and so on. But because we don't have any clear rule sets around what can you call a transition, some parts of the proceeds, buying new planes, are not particularly ambitious, to be honest. And we're the first to argue that you need a level of ambition commensurate with achieving the Paris Agreement. And that's part of the work to be done, which we're doing in the European taxonomy along these lines. But hey, good luck to them. They got it out, and it was a very successful bond, and it proved the point, if you like. So we can niggle about this.
Are we seeing the right companies go to the market with these bonds? I mean, putting government bonds aside, private companies or those, are we seeing, you know, are the large, let's say the large polluters, whoever they may be, are they going into this market, or are we seeing those who already have a good track record? I mean, you know,
well, you know, Aqua, for example, has done a large green sukuk, and it's a polluter because the bulk of its portfolio, or majority of its portfolio, still fossil fuel energy generation, but it has a strategic plan to shift towards renewables. For me, that is the perfect solution. That's exactly what we need to be seeing. And so we, in fact, certified their issuance, their green sukuk issuance under the climate bond certification scheme. We're going to see a lot more of that. But also there are government bodies and semi-government. We've seen Islamic Development Bank issue a green sukuk, for example. And we've seen it in other parts of the Islamic world too. You'll be aware that Indonesia has now issued 2 incredibly successful green sukuk. We've seen the growth of these in Malaysia, in sukuk format. And what our feeling is that this is going to grow. In Morocco, we've seen bonds rather than sukuk being issued. There have been half a dozen now, green bonds. The Capital Markets Authority is very keen on the idea, promoting the idea. My hunch is what we'll see out of the Gulf is a shift towards more sukuk because the investors are very interested in it. But some organizations will be better placed to do a bond, or will just simply do a bond. Hey, that's fine.
The IEA, we were talking about this with energy, when we're focusing on or talking a little bit about energy companies, whether it's power companies or other, the IEA says the world needs to have, I've got a statistic here in front of me, has to spend over $1 trillion a year for the next 3 years, you know, if we're going to get back on track with the energy transition, just focusing in on, you know, energy companies and countries.
Yeah, that's probably about right. I mean, we're winning in one way. The cost of solar in the latest UAE auctions, unbelievably.
Yeah, they've driven that down incredibly.
I mean, and it's still dropping 20% per year. So it's extraordinary. So honestly, energy from solar is so cheap that actually it's making other forms of energy uncompetitive. In India, 60% of coal, or sorry, I should say 40% of coal-fired power plants, possibly 60%, are currently running at a loss. Because solar has come in, private IPPs have come in and set up solar plants and fed energy directly to industrial combines and bypassed the coal plants because they're just cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, solar has had great success, and you could almost say it's done it. You know, it's succeeded, and it's off, if you like. They're off to the races. But what this region is doing a lot of still is investing in you know, technologies that can clean traditional oil and gas. You know, obviously pollutants and production, and that's, you know, the question over that is, you know, whether investors will remain interested in doing that, obviously, because, you know, the fossil fuels are here to stay for a while. Solar has been solved. How much investment is continuing to go into innovation to clean oil and gas, and you know, there's debates around us.
Well,
around that.
I'm going to say my general speech I make is be very wary. Some things are going to change a lot faster than most of us think. Let's take automobiles, which currently consume, or transport, consume 60% of all petroleum. The Chinese government has a state policy to shift the country to electric vehicles at an unbelievably rapid rate. Every single car company in China, including the foreigners, are investing in electric plants and electric R&D. Now, there's a famous picture of New York Broadway in 1900, which shows, in Times Square, which shows the streets full of horse and carts. Yeah. And in the far corner, there is an electric vehicle. It's electric. And the same picture was taken 10 years later.
Okay.
And there is only a single horse and cart in the far corner, and everything else is automobiles, with quite a lot of electric in there. We are going to see the same change when it comes to urban transport. Honestly, it's not just Tesla. The US is actually an outlier, although I do note that General Motors announced a $42 billion US investment in electric cars last week. It's China, which is the world's largest car market now. They'll drive everything. Now, what that means is there is going to be a dramatic falling off in demand for oil. And China's the one leading this because they do not want to be energy dependent on outside countries. So they're trying to shift to all options which involve them importing less fossil fuels. So if you're a country in the Gulf, you need to be thinking about what your 5, 10, and 15-year investment strategy is to be prepared for this. You might call it a possible shock. Let's just say there's a high risk of this change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, some of the countries, the UAE and Saudi are taking some very, very strong steps in that direction, obviously, while being fossil fuel
exactly right
producers.
And that will lead to a lot more green bonds and green sukuk.
Yeah. And so green bonds and green sukuks, what is the next sort of over the horizon instrument that you would see, which perhaps is being played with or not, but beyond green bonds, is there anything? What would be the next step in that choice of instruments?
Well, there's an instrument where we'd like to go with the bond market, but before we get there, the implications of taxonomies, which are green definitions, if you like, that we started the climate bonds issue, which govern the certification, like Aquis certification, is in a regulatory setting, they have a broader impact. So in Europe, the taxonomy does more than govern the green bond market when it comes in. It also governs the disclosure regime under the implementation of the Task Force of Climate Finance Related Disclosures, which Europe and the UK and other countries are now bringing as mandatory requirements. All corporates, investors and banks in Europe will need to provide disclosure on an annual basis about high-risk investments and also sustainable investments. And to do that, they'll need to reference the legislation about what you're allowed to call sustainable. Common language becomes a norm.
Yeah, well, you just used the word common language. So common language, let's say even within Europe, they're figuring it out. How important is commonality in terms of the pace of definition and change across regions? Banks sometimes hesitate to fund XYZ projects because there isn't this sort of commonality of recognition of how things are defined or how they're used.
Well, it helps a lot.
Market,
markets are, are commoditized beasts. The more you can bring in commoditized definitions and rules, the more they grow. And bringing in a common language is a classic example of a commoditized definition. And remember that what we're doing here is we're deliberately removing the onus from the issuer or the investor or the bank to determine what is green. We're simply saying, look, here's a rule set. All you have to do is understand the rule set. We don't really care if you understand why or how. That's just the rule set.
The rule. And how quickly do you think a region like this in the Middle East could implement, the regulations that are needed to establish these? Here there is still a criticism, despite all the advancements that happen, is that policies behind technology, policies behind doesn't facilitate the private sector, etc. Is there an understanding now here in the Middle East that tools like this are absolutely essential, and does the policy behind it support that?
Well, we've had the launching of UAE regulators' green finance principles, which has been a big step. We provide a little bit of advice to that in the development of that. And for my purpose, that was a fantastic common agenda by all regulators and other financial actors in the UAE as a good first step. Do they need to do a taxonomy? Probably not, because a lot of the capital that's being chased will be Chinese or European capital or US capital, where at least in China and US, there are taxonomies and definitions. So for the moment, I think the UAE is a classic entrepreneur economy, particularly Dubai, can reference other standards for the purposes of its work. Over time, that might change. As a local economy develops, it might be useful to simply at least publish rules which are synchronized and international, but have a UAE flavor. That's a possible direction to go in.
And just to jump across, go west to the US, you mentioned it earlier, and where we're at there with this particular market. I mean, obviously the US is a whole other beast, and it's there's some things are done on the federal level, and a lot of things are not. And just seen as a case in point, when Donald Trump withdrew from the Paris climate agreement, you still had states like California saying, we're going to do our bit, we're going to do what we like. We're not listening. How prevalent is sort of climate bonds there? Are they needed as much? Are they attractive to your typical investors who'd be in the US market?
It's a massive market. In fact, the three big currencies representing roughly a quarter each, depending on who's top of 𝖤𝖵𝖴𝑜𝑝s, are renminbi, euro, and US. And in some measures, US is the largest. So it depends which measure you're using. So it's actually a major part of the US market. Investors in the US, institutional investors, have been extremely focused in this kind of market. They're concerned about risk. They see the forward risk of climate inaction or different sorts of climate action having a material effect on their portfolios. So it's not only climate impacts, floods, cyclones, or pandemics, which is at its root a climate event, because it's throughout the degraded environments. It's also policy changes. So every investor we speak to in the US says climate policy changes are happening and are going to happen. The Trump years were a 4 years blip as far as investors were concerned. It didn't change their view, it just changed their timescale.
Yeah, I mean, and the Biden administration coming in has already been pledging, obviously, that it's going to be not just rejoining the Paris Agreement, but investing in new initiatives and taking that very seriously. I think President-elect Biden just appointed John Kerry as his climate czar just yesterday, right? Bringing him back.
Exactly right.
Back into the fold. So that's definitely progress there, but we'll see what happens. Sean,
so just that we've got all the investors confirmed who want to do it anyway, and they've already been planning. They've been looking for investments that are lower risk of climate policy going forward, and that's what the taxonomy presents. These are investments that are not likely to be hit by policy. Just the last thing, just to remember what this looks like now. We have just in the last few months seen Europe adopt 2050 and tough 2030 targets. We've seen China adopt basically the same. Japan and Korea follow through with an amazing announcement by the Japanese Minister of Prime Minister. And South Korea is going to say the same thing. So early after January 20, we will have all the world's largest economies lined up saying we now have dramatically tougher climate targets for the future. And they're also going to say, help us figure out how to do it. But the point is, they're on the road. Yeah.
And the last question to you then, where do you see, let's say, take a 5-year outlook for this particular market of green bonds? How percentage, if you had to put a percentage out there of how much you see it growing by in the next 5 years, by 2025, what would you say?
Well, what we're looking at is 25% of global fixed income issuance being in this green format. When we look at adaptation as well as mitigation. In emerging markets, the focus will be adaptation, and the SDGs are a kind of indicator of what that looks like. So pretty large. And also, I have to say, I am extremely bullish now about the Islamic bond potential in the Gulf area. And because we're seeing many countries from Nigeria and Morocco to Indonesia and Malaysia starting to grapple with this, and the extent to which the UAE, Dubai in particular, is a financial center. At the very minimum, it's responding to the market. And at the maximum, it might be helping drive the market. So it's going to happen. The only question is how quickly and how big.
Okay. Well, hopefully sooner rather than later. Sean Kidney, thank you very much for joining us today for our 2-minute warning interview. Great to have you with us. And best of luck in selling those and issuing those bonds towards climate change. Thank you very much for joining us. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you for the time.
Thank you.